Okay, so I want to talk today about something I'm really leaning into and trying to do more. And that's the power of saying yes to stuff. It's the power of embracing creativity and being optimistic, um, rather than being cynical and dismissive, and all that stuff. So, really trying to lean into the potential, the possibility of saying yes and being a part of saying yes versus being dismissive and saying no. We've all been there. We've all had a cynical moment. And I think cynicism is something that we need to be mindful of because it has its place. But if we are going to live a creative, a rebellious, an optimistic life, then I think we need to learn how to say yes and how to be optimistic. And there's a reason why we don't do that. And that's because optimism takes courage. Optimism requires us to be brave. Cynicism doesn't require any of that stuff. In fact, cynicism is often the easy way out. So, through this video, this short presentation, I'm just going to start to unpack and look at the differences between a creative mindset, a cynical, and a critical mindset, and really start to explore the differences between being a critic and being a creative. I think that they are very different, and I think they invite different approaches and perspectives. So, firstly, I think I want to talk about critics because critics are very good at telling people what something is or what it isn't, and they really hold the power of no in their hands. I think no is an incredibly useful but very low energy tool to dismiss something, to say, oh, it could be better, it could be all of the things that it isn't. It's very easy to point out what something isn't. And I think negativity is really easy, isn't it? And critics find it very easy to say no because it requires minimal effort. You don't need a lot of energy to say no because you're not committing to something, you're rejecting something. And I think rejecting is a lot easier to do than committing. And also, I think critics and the power of no, they have a safety in the detachment of no, right? Because criticism in some way creates a sense of detachment. And actually, it creates safety from personal investment. By saying no, I'm standing back and saying, well, my perspective is no. And I'm just going to say no, I'm not going any further than that. It doesn't require much more energy for me to really participate. And I would say, whilst no has its place, it's actually quite an unproductive way to interact with the world, right? Saying no isn't an invitation, right? And I think you have to invite things into your world. Whilst I'm saying you should never say no, absolutely not. No is an incredibly useful tool when it's necessary. But I think treating the your experience of the world as in I don't like that, I don't like that, I don't like that, and beginning to just reject and dismiss and say no is incredibly unproductive. And it stifles innovation, it stifles personal progress, and ultimately it stifles growth, right? um, Saying no all the time is it ultimately becomes a rejection of yourself, and the world around you. And I think that's the difference between creative mindset and the critical mindset, right? The critical mindset uses no, because it's low investment. You don't have to really act on no. You can kind of be dismissive of something. But I think it takes great courage to say yes, um, because saying yes means embracing something. It means embracing an idea. It might require some sort of integration into your worldview. You might have to change, right, by saying yes. You might be put into a position where you feel uncomfortable in some way, but you're willing to take that risk. Because taking risks and saying yes are the same thing, really, because yes is a risk, isn't it? When you say yes to somebody or something, you're effectively saying, okay, let's do this thing. And it means ultimately being open to failure. So saying yes is actually saying, I am open to seeing where this goes. It might not work, but in the spirit of the creative mindset, I'm going to say yes. And ultimately, saying yes means being vulnerable. It means putting ourselves out there. Because if we're not saying yes and we're not being vulnerable, then really we're shutting down, right? And that's where the courage comes in. You really have to have that kind of bravery to be able to step into the world and say yes to things, um, because it's very easy to say no. And I think, saying yes is a creative act in itself because it opens up possibility. You start the ball rolling. Yeah, and it's very easy to keep your cards close to your chest, to constantly reject people. And in some respects, being a critic is kind of that detached, person in the high tower mentality of like, well, I've never actually made anything or I've never actually done anything, but I'm going to stay safe and up here and I'm just going to tell you what is good and what's not. So it's the difference between having good taste and putting your taste to the test. So in some respects, you could say the creative mindset is a taste test because you're always rubbing up against how good you are. By saying yes, you're always growing and always pushing the boundaries. I mean, this invites a really interesting dynamic, doesn't it? What is the ratio of yes to no? Now, this is not a scientific experiment. I don't really have the data, but intuitively, I think that there are a lot more ways to say no, right? You can reject an infinite amount of things. There are an infinite amount of things that tell you what you're not. The idea that if you say, well, I don't like hamburgers and I don't like omelets, or I don't like horror movies, I don't like this, I don't like that, I don't like that. Use an infinite amount of things for you to say no to. But in reality, I think there's a very small amount of things we can say yes to. And I think in some ways, like one yes is worth 10,000 easy no's, because one yes is an incredible journey. And actually, by saying yes, you learn a lot about yourself because everybody can be defined by what they don't like. That's easy. But actually, I think the secret of living a good life or living well is to be defined by the things you love. And I'm always inspired by people who really love things. I think that, passion and indulging a passion for whatever that might be is always exciting because it really brings to life a person's character. You can really see a person being themselves and being authentic. So I think that, the ratio of yes to no is, I think no can be or inauthentic in some ways. It can be authentic in some ways too, obviously making decisions. But I think in general, the value of yes to no is, I think a good quality yes is worth more than 10,000 low quality no's, because no is a prevalent condition. Um, and I think it takes many no's to get to one yes. So I guess you have to kiss a lot of frogs to get to the prince or the princess or whoever you're looking for in some respects from a creative perspective. Now, I guess when I look at the critical mindset and I look at cynicism, I think for me, no and professional cynical people have developed a kind of position that is really about kind of being disappointed. You know, I think cynical people have a fear of disappointment. And I think cynics or critics often say no, actually to avoid a fear of being disappointed. So I think whilst we look at cynicism or critical thinking as quite a negative thing, actually I think it's a defense mechanism against being disappointed. Right? It's effectively a shield against the emotional investment and then the potential disappointment, because disappointment is a hard thing to deal with, especially if you really believe in something. And actually, I think cynics in some way are people who can't really afford emotionally to be disappointed again. And that sounds like quite a hard thing, but we've all been there. The fear of being disappointed makes us reject things out of hand, right? Oh, it's not going to work. Oh, that's never going to happen. Oh, that person's going to let me down. That's not very good, right? Cynicism is I think a defense mechanism, really. And I think really what cynical people were doing is actually just trying to avoid the risk of being, you know, kind of sad or upset. And actually, that actually reduces their progress. It makes them less able to create and innovate and be able to come up with original ideas, because by rejecting things in some way, we're shutting it down. And the only reason we're shutting it down is because we don't want to be disappointed, and that's just an opinion, by the way. And I think what's really fascinating is actually a lot of the most cynical people actually start out as really passionate creatives, and through disappointment, through maybe not getting what they want, or for feeling like their ideas aren't valued, they transform. People do transform from being extremely creative into quite cynical people. I've been there. I've had that cynical moment, and it's real. And I think a lot of people who start out with brilliant beginnings really have an idealistic view of the world, or they come into the world looking for something and they don't find it, or they find something that wasn't really what they wanted, and they can become disappointed, or they can face criticism, harsh criticism from people who don't really understand or don't really care. And I think actually when you take a great creative person and they face continuous criticism, they can start to be shaped and molded into a cynic, right? And it's the classic kind of like Luke Skywalker, Darth Vader, coming to the dark side. All creative people have to have an aspect of cynicism in them, because that's what makes you have good taste, right? But it's when you start to say no instead of yes, it can develop into a full-blown professional cynic of just pointing out why things aren't very good. And I don't think that's helpful. I don't think it's friendly. And ultimately, I think it can be quite a lonely experience of a self, especially if you have a creative heart. And that's why it takes courage to say yes. It takes courage to be optimistic. It takes courage to take that creative leap, because you're often doing it in the face of what can often be disappointment. So I guess for me, the importance of saying yes is really about driving progress, right? It's about making your life more interesting. It's about taking risks. Sure, you're going to be disappointed. But I do think that the world is created by people who say yes. And I think the world is judged by people who say no. So, what would you prefer to be? A judge? Or do you want to be a creator, someone who does original things, someone who takes risks, someone who says yes? Now, I think we need to celebrate the optimists. I think sometimes when we encounter optimistic people, especially if we have a cynical mindset, at the moment we're going through a recession. There's a lot of kind of stress about and uncertainty. But we have to celebrate the optimists, and we celebrate the optimists by encouraging them to take risks, right? To encourage them to really follow their dreams and support them along the way and encourage their positivity, right? And foster an environment where saying yes is valued. Like if you work in a creative company, or if you're surrounded by people who are very good at saying no, then you start to behave like a person who is in an environment where people say no. So I think always encourage optimistic approach. Obviously, don't be too optimistic, because nobody needs someone who's not living in reality. But in the space of the what can happen and what can't happen, always err on a positive outcome, and then deal with whatever doesn't happen when it happens as a starting point. Because I think actually failure and not being able to do things is a valuable part of the creative process, right? We can learn from failure. We can understand that failure is a critical part of learning. Like you don't always get it right. Like if a young child was learning to walk, And the first time they stood up and effectively tried to learn to walk, and they fell over, and everybody turned around and said, "Oh, you're never going to learn to walk because you failed." We would all be crawling around for the rest of our lives, right? But at some point, we are less optimistic about our own progress. Whereas when we're children, we're incredibly optimistic because we know we are going to change. Well, you never stop changing. And I think part of embracing failure, part of learning from failure is developing resilience. And if you're going to be creative, if you're going to say yes, you will develop resilience because you're going to have to face challenges. That's the part of saying yes, is you put yourself into that mindset of, I'm going to do this, I'm going to try, and whatever comes out of it is valuable. And it's all part of the journey, right? Because we're always growing, we're always changing, we're always kind of taking risks, and it can be difficult. It's not easy. No one ever said it was going to be easy because ultimately creativity is an act of rebellion, right? We're rebelling against the mob. We're rebelling against what we've been taught. Because if we don't, we just end up copying. So saying yes is a way to really do new and different things. So I just wanted to make this presentation today because I actually think that, you know, we live in a world where optimism can often be seen as something that maybe makes us vulnerable. But I think it actually, in that vulnerability, is incredible bravery. So I just wanted to make this kind of video today, really just to encourage everybody to say yes to their professional and personal lives, and just really kind of, when they start to feel cynical, when you start to feel cynical, just put some brakes on and say, hold on a second, like, why am I saying no to this? Am I just rejecting it out of hand, or do I genuinely feel that this isn't a great idea? So yeah, cynicism has its place, but I think optimism is much more valuable. Optimism takes courage, and when you do the courageous thing, you grow in so many ways. So thank you so much, and yeah, I hope this video was useful. Leave a comment, and yeah, we can start a conversation in the chat. Thanks very much.